Welcome to Steve Nallon's Ghost Stories. This episode, The Return of the Handbag, as told by the infamous lady herself. So, Steve, the inspiration for The Return of the Handbag?
Well, it was a conversation with a comedian friend of mine, Nina Benjamin. And I told her about the ghost stories, and she wouldn't ever read ghost stories because it's a thing. She doesn't like ghost stories. And she said to me, well, you are doing a Mrs. Thatcher one, Haunting Downing Street, aren't you? And I said, do you know, I genuinely hadn't really thought about it. She said, well, you've got to. And I sort of realized it would be a good idea from a marketing and all that sort of point of view. And it was one of the, it was about the fourth one I wrote. And so that's what it became, The Return of the Handbag.
I imagine the story behind the story for The Return of the Handbag is going to be, well, not all familiar. There'll be something a little bit unusual in there too.
Well, yes, I think that I've always liked sort of stories with mirrors in them. In fact, there's quite a few mirrors in my collection. There's one in the portrait of a looking glass. And I think that comes from reading Alice Through the Looking Glass, The Adventures of Alice Through the Looking Glass, which is, I think, is slightly more sort of grown-up version than Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Anyway, I've always liked that, and stories with magical mirrors in them, Snow White and the rest of it. So it seemed an obvious place to put Mrs. Thatcher inside the mirror. But that's a situation, not a plot. And to be honest, I don't think the story itself ever really developed much from being a situation, because I came up with the idea that Mrs. Thatcher, in her last years as Prime Minister, when frankly everybody thought she was going bonkers anyway, started seeing the ghosts of all the previous Prime Ministers. So then I realized I had to research all the Prime Ministers, and luckily a friend of mine had written, he'd edited the book, which is about all the different Prime Ministers. And there's a chapter on each. Ian Dale did the editing. And got people who knew what they were talking about to write chapters on it. And it was a really interesting read. And there's some sort of fascinating personal details about the different prime ministers and their historical context and all the rest of it. And I just basically found one or two interesting facts per prime minister and shoved them in the story. It sounds a little bit like making a pie, but whatever. But it was a little bit like that, because it's sort of got a plot, but there's hardly any plot, except Mrs. Thatcher is trapped inside the mirror, and then one day she finds a way out of it, and then starts roaming around Downing Street and blah, 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 blah. So there is a bit of a twist at the end. But really, I think it's a series of short sketches, encounters, vignettes with the... I mean, I think it's quite funny. The little encounters that she has, and a more left-wing friend of mine read it and said that I lived with the angels because he liked the ending.
Well, I guess with it being a supernatural story, not always that plot heavy, more about feeling and emotion and kind of being very creative, and like you say, it lends itself to that, doesn't it, because of the supernatural element?
Yeah, I think that there's a slightly more serious aspect to it, in that Mrs. Thatcher, after she left Downing Street and sort of became Lady Thatcher, I don't think she ever went through a process of reflection, finding, understanding the mistakes that she'd made. She was thrown out in such a brutal way, frankly. But I don't think she ever for the next years, thought, well, I should have done that and I might have done that. And I think probably most prime ministers have go through a more reflective period. Macmillan certainly did it. He was, alive when I was young. But Mrs. Thatcher didn't, and I think that's the ending sort of reflects that, the fact that she didn't really try to ask herself whether she'd made any mistakes or whether she'd done something wrong or whether that was a moral mistake or whatever. I think she on interview she never did any of that, and I sort of wanted the story to reflect that in a sort of supernatural way.
I imagine like in Christmas Carol, you have to have these things shown to you in order to actually believe them and react to them if you're not a naturally reflective person.
Well, and Mrs. Thatcher, and this will come up later, she never had anything of what you may call fancy about her. Her imagination was relatively limited. She didn't particularly enjoy going to plays and theatre, and the books that she read were by, I think, Frederick Forsyth, sort of action adventure stuff, really. I don't think she was a great thinker. She was a political philosopher, certainly, and she understood the political philosophy, but I don't think she had what Dennis Healy used to call a hinterland. Particularly an artistic hinterland that went beyond, that went much beyond politics, and in a way, therefore, it was strange to write a story about a woman who probably would never have believed in ghosts, never have been interested in the supernatural, and suddenly finding herself as a ghost. And she's very practical about it in the story. She just wants to escape the mirror.
Yeah, that's believable. Yes.
I think that is believable. So I tried to make it as believable as possible about probably a very, very skeptical woman who didn't really read, fairy tales and stories of fancy. And sort of that's what I tried to do. But really, to be honest, it's a series of gags and funnies and silliness. And it was, I quite enjoyed it. Return of the Handbag. Well, now, this extract comes at a time when Mrs. Thatcher is alive in Downing Street, and she's begun to sort of see ghosts and stuff. And basically, she is, it's a post-cabinet meeting, and she's stayed by herself in the cabinet room. Well, she's not by herself for long.
I had stayed in the cabinet room after the meeting to look over the latest trade figures, which were not at all encouraging, when suddenly I heard a voice. At first, I thought it was the Trade Secretary returning to discuss the numbers, but on glancing up, I discovered, standing over me, none other than Herbert Asquith.
My darling Venetia,
he said, taking my arm.
Do I find you reading one of my passionate love letters?
Now, the private lives of politicians have never interested me in the slightest, but it was common knowledge that Asquith, who had been Prime Minister in the Edwardian era, kept a mistress called Venetia Stanley, and clearly this ghostly Herbert thought I was she. I hoped that by closing my eyes the phantom would disappear, and it did, only when I opened them, in its place was a prostrate William Gladstone. Those Victorian sideburns were unmistakable, flagellating himself in his underdrawers.
Tempt me not with your body. Cover your bosom, madam. You are the lady of the night, lost to the devil, but I will save you.
It is a historical fact that Gladstone often brought prostitutes back to Downing Street in the hope of saving them from their shameful lives. However, though the neckline of my dress was a little lower than usual, for the day was somewhat warm, one does not expect, when one is leader of Her Majesty's government, to be taken for a floozy. There are those who might think I should have been flattered, for Mr. Gladstone, looking, I must say, every single one of his 84 years, continued to stare at my upper half, whipping his hindquarters as if they were some poor horse on Derby Day. I said to him, as firmly as I could, "Would you kindly stop thrashing yourself into a frenzy while gawping at my bosoms?" So preoccupied was I by the apparition, I hadn't noticed that as I said these words, the Trade Secretary had indeed returned, and, by an unfortunate coincidence, had his hands deep inside his trouser pockets. I cannot say for certain exactly what he was doing. Clearly Mr. Gladstone was invisible to him, but the minister immediately offered his profuse apologies, and went on to say that he had a secret devotion for me, and, if fortune were to smile, would consider leaving his wife. What a ridiculous notion! In the next reshuffle, I had no choice but to put him on the naughty step by sending him to Northern Ireland.
So as we've just seen in the trailer, this episode's film pairing is Prince of Darkness by the great John Carpenter. And, well, why have I paired Prince of Darkness? I was going to say with the Princess of Darkness. No. No, that's well, anyway. Both Prince of Darkness and Return of the Handbag, they delve into the theme of unseen forces influencing reality. Obviously, Carpenter's film uses science fiction to explore this metaphysical evil. Your story, I would say, is more satire on societal norms, and that's just as a reader, you might tell me, "Shut up, Matthew, you're wrong." The pairing, I feel, is like an interesting look at how narratives can challenge perception. So they can also challenge reality. They can challenge authority, and by being afraid or not having the answers, that challenges your authority and challenges your feeling of certainty. So to go into Prince of Darkness a little bit, I think it stands out from the other John Carpenter films. It might not be everybody's favorite John Carpenter film, but I think philosophically it's more ambitious, it's more cosmic, it's eerie, it's the liquid, the gooey liquid is in a church basement. There's this embodiment of Satan, or certainly mirror image of God or anti-God. And the characters are interesting compared to a lot of the more workaday characters of John Carpenter films. In these, they are scientists and students, and they're people who question or certainly have to see it to believe it. And visually, it's got this darkness, but it's got lots of greens and minimal light, and it's claustrophobic, which I think Carpenter does incredibly well in many of his films. But this one's more dreamlike. And I think the descent into paranoia and unraveling sanity of them makes it stand out from possibly maybe only one or two where people of Carpenter's where people really do lose grip on what's real and what's not. So yeah, I paired them mainly because of how horror can be dressed in different forms, whether it's slow creeping dread or whether it's the ghost of a handbag. Both of these narratives, they challenge us to look beyond the obvious, and I would say both of them are definitely not obvious. They ask what we dismiss, what returns, what we hold on to from the past, and maybe what we hold on to within as well. So yeah, I hope you can see where I've come from with this choice, even though tonally they're different. There's a lot in common there.
There is. And I mean, from a very basic plot point of view, it's about the release of evil. And specifically the release of evil through a mirror. We don't really see the mirror till the very end. But I remember seeing this film when it first came out, and that ending freaked me. That grab freaked me out. And I think that the special effects are really special because they're simple. It's stuff that's filmed upside down and backwards and so on and so forth. I think the dream side of it is interesting because that's not in The Thing, and I don't think it's part of Assault on Precinct 13, which is sort of he's very good at sieges, isn't he? He's very good at claustrophobic sieges, and it's sort of a version. That claustrophobia is a version of that, and yet there's a bit of Nightmare on Elm Street in the dream thing and then it gets very complicated because are they receiving messages from the future? And it's got so many things going within it. It's got sort of layers of narrative. So it's supernatural certainly, but it's got that not time travel thing, but sort of messages from the future and changing potential future and so on and so forth. And it's got Donald Pleasance in it, so you can't really argue with that. And we were talking in a previous episode about decapitations. Well, this is my favorite decapitation because she puts her head back on. She sort of
it's very practical.
Put it back on. So no, I think it's and plot wise, it's that escape through the Mrs. Thatcher's escape comes earlier in the story, but and it's I think it's, from what I understand, I think it's a well-known film, but you're right, nobody's going to put it as their favorite John Carpenter film, and yet if it had been the only one he ever made, it would have been seen, I think, much more as a classic.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think In the Mouth of Madness falls in that a little bit as well. That there's so much going on, it's just packed full of ideas. But yeah, sometimes in those claustrophobic stories, almost the simpler the better, to kind of show off the one thing that they're trying to achieve. Sometimes loads of ideas can be a little bit off-putting for people who just kind of want to see something relatively familiar but just with a different spin on it.
I think that compositely they work really well together, and then you've got certain sort of tropes like after all, he's the Prince of Darkness, and Beelzebub means Lord of the Flies, Lord of the Dung, I think it literally translates as. And so you've got that thing with the maggots and the beetles, the black beetles, and they're literally creepy. They're creepy, they're creepy crawlies. And so it's got a psychological horror as well as the sort of head chopped off horror and the creepy maggot horror and Alice Cooper. So, come on.
Yeah.
You can't beat it, really.
No, yeah, you wouldn't necessarily put him down as your obvious choice, would you? So yeah, that
But
does stand.
he,
It's great, you know.
he looks great. He's
Yeah,
perfect. He's perfect casting actually, and
he
no,
is.
it's got humour in it as well. So I think it's a great score. So yeah, it's a great movie. Scott's artwork, well, it had to be herself. And there she is in all her glory. And we got in touch, with Roger Law, who owns Spitting Image, and said, could we use the Spitting Image? And Roger was so supportive. And he gave us permission, and Scott was working on the stage version of Spitting Image at the time, which I went to see, and we got the Thatcher puppet backstage at the Birmingham Rep, and Scott took some pictures, and what you see is the famous Spitting Image Margaret Thatcher.
Yes. It's what I think of when I think of her. It's what I think of before I think of the actual person, if I'm honest. Because as a child, I used to sneak up and stay up late to watch Spitting Image. So,
well, if you're young, in the 80s, you're unlikely to watch the news at 10 because it's boring. But goodness me, you'd really want a Thatcher, and she's there hitting people. And I've said this before many times,
but of course the Thatcher voice. If you wish to try to be accurate, you would do it like this. But it didn't really fit the image of the puppet. So I had to make Mrs. Thatcher sound like the image that we created of her on Spitting Image, and that is a totally different thing. And so I borrowed the House of Commons voice. The right honourable gentleman. So I, doesn't understand fiscal policy. So, that's how I, transformed. And she does sort of sound like that in my head now.
Yeah,
even though she doesn't really sounded like that at all. But I think Scott did a great job as well with the mirror. And I think it was probably the first one he did. No, Hattie Jakes was the first one he did. But I think this was the second. And it perfectly fits the story.
Steve, the story pairing for this Thatcher-based tale.
Well, it's a bit of a tenuous link, but I hope an interesting one in that it's from this book, one of the great classic ghost books, and it's called Autumn Cricket by a man called Lord Dunsey. And I'll just read a bit of it out to you because it may sound familiar in a different context. And it's about a man who is basically sat at night on the edge of a field. Well, that's the trouble, he said. It's not good for him at his age to be out there in the cold like that. And we can't stop him unless we have him legally restrained. But surely you can't shut the man up, I said, merely to prevent him from going out into the cold. Oh, he said, it's more than that. The old man thinks there's a cricket match going on there every night, and he goes out to look at it. Who does he think he's playing? I asked. W.G. Grace and Gunn and a lot of other famous players, all of them men. All of them he had seen on that ground, and all of them dead. We're trying to get him certified, and that'll stop him going out at night. Will he like that? No, he said. He wants to go and see the ghosts playing cricket. Well,
I can see.
The tenuous link is W.G. Grace. And it's tenuous because there were very few stories about real people. So in my looking through all the ghost stories, I came across only a couple that had real people in them. And this was a rarity. And also, frankly, I wanted to include this because it's a very early version of Field of Dreams. Because it's about a man who's imagining, and it's got a lovely, sweet ending, really. And that is the ghosts invite him to join them on the pitch. And that, of course, means he has to die. But his heaven will be playing cricket with W.G. Grace. And it's only about 2 or 3 pages long. But as I say, what I discovered was that there were very few ghost stories with real people. There's one with Ben Jonson, and I think Shakespeare turns up in it, and I think there's one with the Emperor Tiberius. So there are others, but there are relatively few, actually.
Well, W.G. Grace works perfectly because, much like Margaret Thatcher, if I think of W.G. Grace, his beard and his appearance comes to me straight away. I'm not saying Margaret Thatcher has a beard, but what I'm saying is that I feel like I confused my sentence halfway through. But someone who comes to mind straight away, the vision of which, when you're writing a story, that only happens if you know who that person is.
Well, that's interesting as well, because I think that you and I exactly the same. I have caricature images of W.G. Grace in my head rather than the real thing. I would recognize the caricature images of that huge beard, probably more than the man himself. But and it's a really charming. And then the other thing about it is, and the guy who wrote Shoeless Joe did not, steal it from Lord Dunsey, but it's that one of those things where really no story is original ultimately. And somebody somewhere, whether it's 1,000 years ago or whenever, probably got there first. But it's very different. I mean, it's a different sort of tale than Field of Dreams.
It can spark you off in that direction, though, can't it?
And I think it's got the same charm actually as Field of Dreams. And you can't imagine an unpleasant ghost story that would involve cricket. It's that one of the things. The rules of there aren't any rules in cricket. There are laws of cricket. It's the laws of cricket that probably forbid unpleasant ghost stories about the game.
Yeah, it just wouldn't be cricket, would it? If we had something.
You're here all week. Well done for getting that.
My obscure but fascinating fact about Prince of Darkness in this case is that John Carpenter wrote this screenplay for Prince of Darkness under the pseudonym Martin Quatermass as an homage to British writer Nigel Neal, creator of the Quatermass series. Now, that is because the film blends theoretical physics with supernatural horror, exploring the idea of evil as a form of antimatter. And I think that this was John Carpenter trying to aspire to that same level of sort of science fiction firmly rooted in science and not as much in the fiction side. So I found that really interesting. I have seen quite a few of the Quatermass films over the years, and I can feel that sometimes that the sort of primeval ooze coming through is definitely something that seems similar. But yeah, I found that fascinating. I'm not sure if your fact is going to be a little bit more in depth.
Mine is exactly the same as yours in a way. It's because it's me paying a little tribute to Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol, and hopefully you see what I mean. So I'm going to read this out. This is from this is my favorite version of the Christmas Carol. It's a wonderfully annotated book that tells everything you ever wanted to know about Christmas Carol, but we're afraid to ask. Anyway, this is just as he's coming to his home on Christmas Eve, and he approaches the knocker. And I'll do it as Alistair Sim, because I'm a huge Alistair Sim fan, and he was in the film.
Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it day and night during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge has as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, that's a bold word, the corporation, alderman, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Right, well, that was Mr. Dickens at his best. And here's Mrs. Thatcher Christmas Eve in her room.
As I was perusing my Christmas cards, the chimes of midnight struck. I then looked up, and my eyes happened to rest upon the moulding in the fireplace. It was the face of that young man I spoke of earlier. Now, I must have seen that face day and night for much of my residency here in Downing Street, and I'm sure you'll agree that I have little of what was once called fancy about me. Put plainly, I do not imagine things that aren't there. Let it also be borne in mind that although I had seen all those portraits of previous prime ministers, I hadn't given any of them much thought over the last 8 or 9 years. And yet, as I stared at that mantel panel, I saw in the marble, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a moulding of a young man, but the face of William Pitt the elder. Yet, as I looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it suddenly became a marble moulding again. To say that I was not startled would not be untrue, so I went over and looked more closely. Goodness me, it was once again the face of William Pitt, and to my astonishment, the phantom spoke.
Well, that was my little tribute to
It
Mr.
worked
Dickens.
perfectly, I think, to hear them side by side.
Yeah,
Also,
and-
you're doing a public service there, Steve, because hopefully, well, I think this will be very, very close to the GCSEs, and as I know all too well at the moment, a lot of children are going back over their notes about A Christmas Carol. So this is perfect timing.
I hope they don't, if they buy this book, and I hope they don't get it mixed up and end up quoting this instead in their exam.
Well, yeah.
But yes, it's a literary in joke, really. It's also one of those things where when you read it as Alistair Sim, you realise that Christmas Carol really was written to be read aloud. It's got that real, can any man tell me if he can? It's very intimate and very chatty. And I've always liked those phrases of, and again, he's got this thing of the phantom knocker, becoming a knocker and then being Marley's face and then going back, and it's beautifully. So I've nicked it, frankly. I stole it occasionally, word for word.
Well, why not? And ultimately, I think it's a very smartly written book in the sense of, if you're going to try and get through to people, which essentially what he wanted to do, to kind of, shine a light on things that he was unhappy with in the world at that time and that he'd experienced himself. That, you have to accept that some people are not able to reflect in that way and don't want to see these things unless they are forced to. And in order to do that, we either force them individually, or we have a story where a proxy is forced into seeing these things and making choices. And I feel that Margaret Thatcher and Ebenezer Scrooge are perfect bedfellows when it comes to what I'd imagine. Like, obviously, one's a real person, one's fictional, but still, need to see it in front of them in order to do something or believe it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's the Christmas Carol is one of my favourite stories. The ghosts, they're not really ghosts, they're sort of phantoms of time, really, past, present, and future. Yeah. And the Ghost of Christmas Past revives his memory. And here's another obscure but fascinating fact: Mrs. Thatcher's great grandfather was called Ebenezer. Or was it her grandfather? I can't remember now, but I remember putting that in a book I wrote years ago about Mrs. Thatcher, and Tom Holt, who I was writing, he said, "Oh, you can't have that. Nobody will believe it." I said, "Well, it's factually true. Yeah. Her great grandfather, but anyway, she certainly has an Ebenezer in her family."
Presented without comment, yeah.
Oh, bar humbug, bar humbug.
So this episode, I feel it uncovered a lot. Pairing Return of the Handbag with Prince of Darkness, it opened what I feel was a really good dialogue, thinking about satire and supernatural horror, which isn't done very often. What initially seemed like an unusual match when I first thought of it, I think it revealed a shared obsession within the story, the fear of unseen forces, whether they're lurking in the shadows of a church basement or behind the veil of tradition and social performance. The Return of the Handbag is more than just a ghost story. I think it's very observed commentary on memory and identity and cultural baggage. Literally. I didn't realize that I used the word baggage. But by the end of us discussing this, I guess I can see that ghosts aren't just something external, but something internal as well. Regret or repression or unspoken truths that the handbag in this case is doing more than just returning, it's confronting.
Wow. Well, my takeaway is in a way more personal. In that is, I don't think I'm ever going to escape Mrs. Thatcher, and I'm sort of quite happy to. I'm amazed that so many years after, she left Downing Street, I'm still asked to do. I was aware when I was writing the beginning of the story that there'll be a younger audience who I could not assume that they would know her history, so I had to sort of find a way of explaining who she was actually, and so on. But no, I'm actually quite happy about it, because I really enjoyed reading about the prime ministers. It was fun to go back to that voice, even though I'm writing in that voice as opposed to speaking in that voice.
Though I do think perhaps it might be a good idea if there is a version when she's speaking. Who knows? Who knows? Just rejoice at that news.
Well, I hope you can guess what sort of ghost story it will be next time by what's above me and behind me and on my head and what I'm wearing. It's Under the Mistletoe. A Christmas ghost supernatural tale.